Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Markets Live. I'm really excited to be here live with my favorite guest, Alex Cohen, CEO of Urvin Finance, my fellow co-founder in this intense journey that we've been on over the last few years. And we're here to talk about some fun subjects. The government may be shut down, but don't you worry, we're still out here working. And so on today's episode of Let's Talk Markets Live, we'll tell you exactly what we've been working on. And we thought we'd discuss a few of the policy issues that are keeping us up at night and changing markets in all sorts of different ways. I'm excited to tell you about my trip down to DC in September. I was seated on an SEC roundtable directly between SIFMA and Citadel. Spoiler alert, they did not care for what I had to say. We'll get to all that, but we're going to start somewhere entirely different. Alex, Exxon Mobil's new retail proxy voting scheme.
Yeah, Dave, it's great to be back on Let's Talk Markets. It's been some time, but I think really just diving right in. One of the things that has come up frequently in conversations, at least that I'm having, both with retail investors and industry participants, writ large, is the rising tide of individual investor engagement in markets. Whether it's investing itself as a fraction of markets or just overall engagement in terms of PR, customer service, just the rising tide is there, and it's not yielding. It's continuing deeply. And I think one of the challenges that companies, issuers, the companies that we all invest in and support, have faced consistently over time, and that some of our guests historically have articulated, is this kind of juxtaposition, this tension between what they're seeing as increased retail investor engagement and then what they see manifest in terms of their proxy voting participation. And proxy voting participation historically, as reported by Broadridge, has been pretty consistent at around 30% for years upon years. So essentially, while institutional investors vote their proxy around 80%, individual investors vote historically around 30%. And that can present a problem for companies who are trying to engage in certain governance actions, trying to create a quorum, trying to push through certain executive priorities where there might be institutional investors who may not be fully aligned, but retail investors who see the executive vision want to go along and want to pursue that. But even if that's the case, historically, 30% of retail investors vote. So what Exxon Mobil did, and this is the subject of a recent SEC no comment letter. And what I want to do is take a no action letter. And what I want to do, as I'm about to explain the intricacies of no action letters, is take a step back and actually explain a little bit around what a no action letter is. And essentially, when companies, participants in public markets, want to engage in the gray area, and what that means is most law, and for purposes here, I am an attorney. I practiced law for 10 years at a high level. I'm no longer a practicing attorney, but I do have a fair amount of insight. When companies want to engage in the gray area of the law, and most things are the gray area of the law, very rarely does something map out into the written word, and very rarely does something map out into an automatic, red flag. That gray area can be nebulous and difficult to plan around, which is something companies want to do, obviously, is plan. So what they can do is, usually as a first instance, they'll hire some lawyers down in DC and say, hey, can you go into the SEC, talk to the relevant parties, talk to them on a no-name basis. Like, don't disclose who your client is. Don't tell them it's us. Just go there and ask them what they would do in this hypothetical fact set. And usually the questions that those conversations yield are valuable questions because they're insights into what the sensitivities of the regulator might be when they're actually reviewing that sort of fact set for maybe an enforcement action or, rule change or what have you. So that's usually the first step, is this no named basis engagement with regulators where you get some questions, you'll figure out whether you want to move forward from there. Assuming you do want to move forward based upon whatever the questions are, you'll then, if you still think it's a gray area, but you want to get additional level of comfort, right? Based on that, you could just choose to engage in the conduct. You could just be like, hey, our risk level, I think we're good. We're just going to go for it.
Right.
It's gray area. We haven't heard anything that's a red flag. What you can also do if you want to decrease the risk that you're exposing your company to is submit a request for a no action letter, which means we're going to summarize what we think the relevant governing law is. We're going to summarize the facts as they apply here with specificity, with high detail, and we're going to send it in to regulators to say, this is what we're thinking about doing. Would you take action based upon this law and this fact? And sometimes the answer is yes. Like, this is the reason why. These are the factors we considered. This is how it bounces up against precedent. We don't like this. We think that these are too risky. And then based on that, you can fine tune the risks. You can try again, different things like that. But if you receive a no, like, we wouldn't take action based upon the facts and law that you present, that's another level of comfort that a company can have to engage in certain nebulous gray area. And companies use this in lots of different spheres, in the crypto sphere, in ETFs, in proxy, and that's what really kind of brought the no action process, at least this year, to my attention. Is one of the no action letters that the SEC recently issued was requested for by Exxon Mobile. And it ties into what I mentioned earlier, which was this lack of participation of retail investors typically at proxy voting season. And
So
Exxon Mobile,
Alex, let's take a really quick step back for a second, because I think that a lot of the people who are listening are the kind of retail investors that do vote or who actually care about voting. And maybe it's a little strange of an idea, this idea that retail investors don't vote. Maybe some of them are the kind of people who get that giant, proxy packet in the mail and they're like, why would I do anything with this? And they toss it. So let's just, what is it that people are voting on each year? Why does it matter? Why is corporate governance important? And why is it, do you think, and have you learned from, because you spend all day talking to issuers and talking to transfer agents and everyone in between, why is it that they believe that retail investors don't vote?
Yeah, I think you can unpack that question both in terms of why they believe, and then I think essentially factually why it exists, why it is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think it'll amaze lots of folks that there's been a huge education provided by the crowd and you, Dave, and others to me over time, both in terms of the specifics of the problem and its pervasiveness, which is shocking. People view sophisticated parties as inherently knowledgeable, inherently all-knowing, and it is amazing that the disconnect in knowledge exists so far on both sides. Right? Like, why is the system not actually working? Why are my shareholders not actually voting? And shareholders are like, why does the company that I support think I don't care? Right? Like,
Right.
it's and the answer is disintermediation. There's been too much intermediation. There's been too much built up kind of tolls and stop gaps that both parties need to cross through in order to ultimately reach what markets were designed to do, is develop a relationship between shareholders and issuers, shareholders and companies. That
Isn't
is
it funny
fundamentally.
that, we've talked about it so many times on this podcast, and I've talked about it so many times, almost whenever I speak about markets. There are two parties that markets are here to serve: investors and issuers. And yet, who do markets serve? Intermediaries, the middlemen. Everything is set up for the middlemen. All the rules are made by the middlemen. All the money is made by the middlemen.
And why is that? It's because that's where the value lies. It's investors and shareholders that matter most.
Yes.
And so everything that's built up to separate them is to decrease the exchange of value that exists between those two parties. That's
Right.
where the value is being derived from, is that interaction. Why don't, so to your question, why is there a perception that retail investors don't vote? Well, number one, I think that's a narrative that's reinforced largely by the mainstream narrative. Like, you see it everywhere. I think there's rare pockets of retail investor enthusiasm. I think most notably, obviously, is GameStop in 2021, where there was just a full vote. But more recently, Tesla's vote for its comp package to Elon for $1 trillion, or in a very tangible way, when there was a proxy fight, Disney marshaled its retail shareholders because it has a great rewards and relationship program with its shareholders, and in those ways, those companies were able to receive part of that value that's stored in those pockets. I think the perception of non-voting, you identified it when you waved your hypothetical envelope around. I think some of that perception is real, and I think it's because the way that shareholders and people, right? They're just people, expect to interact with the process is not being met, right? They're being sent these antiquated methods and being told this is important, but how can it be important if we're not investing to communicate with me and investing to communicate with the company in a way that underscores that importance? This is a piece of mail that I get nothing from. Nothing's
Right.
from.
Right.
So I think that matters, and that bears out in the numbers. I was at the Shareholder Services Association conference this past July, and they were talking about ways that were effective to get retail investors to vote more in proxy. And probably not surprisingly, SMS texting with deep links into that account proxy was the number one way. And it converted not just the most in terms of click through, but also the number of shares, like the actual size of holdings. And there's an instance where communication is occurring in a way that people are, expect in this day and age. And that stimulated, I think, a 70% vote conversion, which is much more aligned to that 80% institutional figure than the 30%. So I think part of it is, Fed perception. Part of it is the reality on the ground is that people's technological expectations aren't being met, and that's impacting overall participation. Whereas institutional investors get a phone call, they get handheld. So of course they're going to get, an 80% conversion. But all of this dovetails into what this no action letter was and is, and the implications it has going forward. So what Exxon proposed to the SEC in its request for no action letter was essentially, we want to have shareholders opt in one time to essentially vote yes for everything. And they can change their vote around a few key things in a timely basis. But if they don't show up, if they're part of what is that perceived 70% of silent, absent retail shareholders, that 70%, instead of being absent, is going to be a default yes, provided that that shareholder opted in the first instance.
Mhm.
And on the face of it, there's a few different implications, I think, to that. The SEC came back, did its analysis, and said, yeah, we're not going to take action on this, which is tacitly saying you can go ahead and do this. And Exxon being Exxon, it's a very large player. Lots of other companies use these no action letters as soft guidance for what's acceptable in their own programs. The limitation there is that the programs need to match exactly what the no action parameters are. If there's any deviation, whatever weight the no action letter had in the first instance is gone. So they are limiting in that regard. But having said that, there's lots of implications for the idea of just having this default opt-in yes proxy or yes vote. And, to corporate leadership, it reduces a strain, certainly, right? It reduces, and this is, you'll start to sense what the other side of the coin is, it reduces the corporate need to reach out and marshal their shareholders. It reduces the burden of presenting information to make sure that your shareholders are understanding and voting with what your vision is. Anyone who's opted in is a banked yes. Like, it's a banked yes. So any sort of action or interaction or communication only risks turning a banked yes into a no.
Okay, right. So if you're a company, let's just say, if you're Exxon Mobile and you have said that 75% of your retail shareholders don't vote and 40% of your shares are held by these retail investors that are not voting, one, you're very happy about this because it means there's the level of automation, which no matter what you do, you've got, like you say, you've banked a set of votes that will vote for whatever you say without even necessarily supporting it. So if you're a company, I see why you would like this. If you're a retail investor, I guess on the one hand, it does simplify things and reduces your mail, maybe. But on the other hand, is your voice now being not heard? Is this destructive to the governance process? I mean, what do you think?
So I think I think it facilitates the governance process in that it helps leadership more easily establish a quorum, which is important for governance. Like, you need present. And also, historically, typically, retail investors do vote in line with institutional, leadership.
Management.
And in that way, if this is let's say an informed and authentically rendered yes vote, sure, my hands are off. Like, it's cruise control, right? Who doesn't like cruise control when the circumstances are appropriate? Like, that's a great. I don't have to stress about making sure.
My car's got active cruise control, which is like so much better, though, right? Like, if there's a car in front of me that I'm barreling towards, it'll slow
too much
down.
Technology. Not my 2012.
It's a great safety feature, but I think the analogy works, right? Like, cruise control is one thing, but shouldn't there be something of a feedback mechanism to ensure that retail investors have any idea what they're voting for when they're voting?
Yeah. I think part of the risk is, and frankly, I think this is the less harmful risk. I think part of the risk is exactly what we're saying is, number one, it's disincentivizing a certain level of aggressive and what historically has been needed communication, because you need to marshal those folks. Part of it risks that silencing and that feedback loop. But the concern I have, and to the regular viewers of Let's Talk Markets, they'll recognize this voice and this topic. We've had guests like Cindy Nisley on from Georgeson, which works a lot in proxy. We've had guests like Jen Borden on from Borden Consulting Group, and she specializes in unclaimed property and escheatment. Both of them specialize in unclaimed property and escheatment. And as soon as I heard this no action letter, that's immediate. I was in a conference and Cindy was sitting right there. And as soon as I saw this no action letter, I looked at her and I talked to some colleagues, and their faces were pale for this exact reason. So how does all of this dovetail into escheatment, which is essentially if you're dormant, if you don't engage with your account, your broker account, your bank account, your property for a specific amount of time, and it varies by each state. Some states it's as little as 2 years. Some states it's more generous than that. Some states there's a death acceleration where you die and it's even sooner, right? The public policy is to try and make property useful, bring it back into the system. Okay, that's great and all, but in practice,
so the state can take your property.
That's exactly it. In practice, states are taking property aggressively from what they consider dormant shareholder accounts. And what that means is if you're learned to set it and forget it, and you just have this Vanguard account and you started and it had 100K in it and it has grown and grown, and you're just not even looking, you don't care because you just know it's in tracking the S&P. If you don't check into that account for a certain amount of time, it will be taken by the state. You can get it back. It's arduous, and it'll only get back at the level of equity value that it was when it was taken. So you're losing a lot of appreciative value. All of that's to say that the main activation point, the main way that people don't become dormant is voting their proxies. That is the number one.
The number one.
That's the number one. That is the thing that people most respond to. And if now what you're doing is saying, here's this automated process that you can opt into once. And once you opt into it, just like everything else, set it and forget it. Where that opt-in point previously was the most successful activation point, it doesn't count as an activation point anymore. A similar thing happened with ACH deposit. So if you get your dividends directly deposited into your bank, if you cash your check, that counts as an activation point because it's proof of life. You had to sign this thing. And you had that's literally, it's proof of life. It's proof of action. Whereas an ACH deposit is not proof of life. It's just this thing that happens automatically. Same thing with this proxy. So if you sign up for automated proxy, you're taking away what is a critical touch point to reduce takings, to reduce escheatment. And that concerns me because what's left? Like, if you're not engaging with shareholders because you don't need to talk to them, if you're not like soliciting their proxy votes because you already got it banked, if people aren't aware of this risk, which is something that we know folks that scream from the rooftops over their entire careers and have been unsuccessful over, my concern is that this practice will lead to a dramatic increase in that in 5 to 7 years.
Okay, so the concern as a primary effect is an increase in escheatment over time from mechanisms, not just this mechanism, but from mechanisms that generally sort of streamline and simplify the process around holding shares and receiving dividends and voting their shares and all of that is leading to sort of like these unintended consequences where you could have an increase of escheatment or an increase in the state taking your property, even though they shouldn't be, because you're doing what you're being told to do, which is set it and forget it, right? You're not supposed to trade actively. You're not even supposed to look at your brokerage account regularly. If you follow those best practices, you might have your property taken, which again, you're right. We've talked about quite a bit in the past on this podcast. But do you think, is there any type of slippery slope here where, is this encouraging or creating an environment where public companies are going to face less and less accountability to their retail investors?
Well, I think that, there's clear evidence. I know exactly what you're thinking is there's a recent action from the SEC where they move quarterly reporting cycles potentially to biannual every 6-month reporting cycles. And the idea is that there's, the articulated positive to the policy is there's too many companies that are choosing to stay private of size in private markets. They're not going public. We're at we went from 7,000 publicly traded companies down to like 4,000, and the view is that part of these burdens is the reason why. And, being partners in a company, I can envision how much of a burden that sort of 3 month, like I'm living for my 3 month. On the other side of that, though, is the biggest beneficiary of that quarterly reporting is retail, is the transparency that that provides, because institutional investors are getting those phone calls or picking up the phone whenever they want. They can achieve that level of transparency and also have typically access to a lot more tools to peel behind the curtain in a way that individual investors don't, in terms of the comprehensiveness of data. So I think in combination, it's hard not to see a pattern building.
Right.
Um, I don't know if it's an intentional policy pattern, but I do think one is emerging where it can be seen that way. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on this topic?
No,
that we
no,
missed? I think we covered it pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just in general, I think no action letters are going to become more of the main dialogue and the main. It used to be enforcement was the main way that the SEC would regulate. I think they've tried to articulate with Chair Atkins specifically saying we want to move away from enforcement, regulation by enforcement, and
For sure.
move.
And no
And I think
action
no
is a
action
quick way
letters.
without going
Mhm.
through the rulemaking process to get stuff done. In fact, there was another no action letter that determined that state trust companies qualify as banks for crypto custody, which is a pretty big development in the crypto space, where registered investment advisors and institutional investors have been struggling on how to custody their crypto. And it wasn't clear to them that state trusts would qualify. You have a bunch of states that have sort of these crypto regulatory and licensing frameworks. And so, this is a very crypto friendly SEC, and they recently issued this no action letter like a little over a week ago. And so, I agree with you. I think this is the kind of thing that we're going to see quite a bit more of. I know the next topic we want to get onto is the roundtable, but we had a comment.
Yeah.
Talk about the GME warrants. Silverback wants us to talk about the GME warrants. I don't know what you want us to talk about. Happy to talk
Well,
about them.
they popped up in the transfer agent accounts pretty promptly.
Yeah, they're trading today. I
Yep.
can see them like trading right now around 3.81. So, not nothing. Actually, I'm surprised. I think people are buying these warrants. It's pretty rich valuation, it seems, but I get it. Warrants are interesting. They're kind of like stock options and kind of not, but sort of fundamentally similar to stock options in that there is a date and a price, and you can exercise the warrant. But the warrant is not like a stock option in that in your exercising, you're not, well, you are sort of getting that. So, it's like a call option. When you exercise it, the writer of that call option is actually the company. And so when you exercise it, you're sending that money to the company. It's a way of raising funds for the company and issuing shares, but in a different way. It's sort of like, usually you see warrants attached as sweeteners to deals that give sort of that upside. If the company exceeds that price, then that warrant suddenly becomes quite valuable. Can be usually, I think it's priced like a stock option, sort of like under the Black-Scholes model, but it's different because it's a 1-to-1. It's not like the warrant is 100 shares. It's one share. So you've got 50 warrants in your account, 100 warrants in your account. That's like 50 or 100 shares. If you choose to exercise them, that's your right to buy those shares at $32. GameStop trading at 24.85 right now, so not there. But hey, got till next year, or maybe longer. The company can always extend that deadline if they want to.
All right, Mr. Lauer goes to Washington.
Okay, yeah. So, and if anyone has specific questions on other things, happy to answer them. But yeah, let's talk about that beautiful haven of democracy and debate, Washington, D.C.
All right, I'm gonna hit you with the hard hitting questions. All right, who, what, where, when, and then we'll hit the last one. So what is this? What are you doing?
Who, what, where, when? So yeah, I was in Washington last month. Had a lovely time, let me tell you. Brought my son with me. My family met me down there. We had a great time, did some touristy stuff. But the reason I went down was to participate in something that was kind of a big deal. The SEC held a roundtable. So who? It was the SEC. What? It was a roundtable. Why?
Why?
Why? It was
Why?
to talk about regulation NMS, National Market System. And one of the fundamental pieces of regulation NMS is Rule 611, which is the prohibition on trade-throughs. So to understand 611 and NMS, you have to take a trip back in time, all the way back to 2005, right? Like the ancient times when the New York Stock Exchange traded 86% of all NYSE listed shares on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, or in a system called ITS. I think it was called that. And there were other regional exchanges, and the NASDAQ had just sort of, popped up. Not quite that, it was older, but it really was coming to be a serious competitor to the New York Stock Exchange. And you had all these other electronic crossing networks, ECNs. And these ECNs were electronic trading systems. It was relatively innovative and new. You might recognize some of these. ARCA was one of these, and now that's owned by the New York Stock Exchange. Island was another one, which was bought by NASDAQ. And so what was happening was you would have better prices on these ECNs than what was on like the New York Stock Exchange, who had total control over trading on New York Stock Exchange names, or almost total control. And so there was no obligation for a broker or for the New York Stock Exchange itself. There was no obligation to honor a better price over here. And so regulation national market system was adopted in 2005 and came into being in 2007. And it basically said, can't do that anymore. There's a better price. You have to honor that. That's now a protected quote. And we're going to create the national feed, the Securities Information Processor, which was already sort of part of the system, but now, weaved together all of the exchanges, and it put the onus on the exchanges to connect to each other and make sure that there were no trade-throughs happening, that an order that was being executed at the offer was not executing at a higher price than was available somewhere else. If you were going to buy a stock, you shouldn't have to pay more if there's a better price available. Now, that was all well and good. It ended the New York Stock Exchange's monopoly. It brought it kicking and screaming into the electronic age, and that was sort of the primary goal. What it did do, though, was introduce a lot of complexity into U.S. markets. It created all of these complex order types, complex behaviors, lots of gaming, lots of latency arbitrage opportunities. It really created the market that we know today, in which latency and speed is paramount. And rent seekers, these high-speed rent seekers, operate all throughout our markets, taking pennies here and there and buying nine-figure homes. And so the SEC at the time had a commissioner. His name is Paul Atkins. And he was not in favor of regulation NMS, and he certainly was not in favor of the prohibition on trade-throughs. And in fact, his dissent was quite prescient in predicting problems that indeed did come to pass. And so now Chair Atkins, one of the first market structure things that he has come out with is to say, why don't we re-examine regulation NMS, which is to say, I didn't like it, I still don't like it, let's get rid of it. Now, one of the criticisms that the SEC, one of the criticisms of Gensler's SEC, it was that they tried to do too much, too fast. without involving the industry. So for all of those of you who think the Gensler's SEC didn't do nearly enough, the main criticism was that they tried to do too much and they didn't hold roundtables. That was like a classic like refrain. You know, they're not consulting industry. Why are they just doing whatever they want? And so here we go, right in the first few months, we've got a roundtable where everyone's interested in what does the industry think about getting rid of Rule 611. Now, not to say anything bad, but you know, Atkins has made his view clear. It is very clear how he feels about Rule 611, and it is very clear that the SEC is on this march towards getting rid of it. But you know, it was a fascinating experience to participate in the roundtable. It was, and I mean, it really was like an honor for me. It was a room full of everyone in market structure. It's not
luminaries.
Luminaries. Yeah, not a lot of us, but plenty of people. A lot of people don't like me, and that's okay. A lot of people do. It's fine. You know, what are you gonna do? But it was very much a room of people who make a lot of money in today's markets. A lot of intermediaries were involved. So, you know, like I said, I had Citadel on one side of me and SIFMA on the other. And for those of you who don't know, SIFMA is the trade association for the brokers. So it's pretty much like being between Citadel and Citadel. They get double representation, aside from all the other associations that they own and run, along with other brokers. So, you know, I was in a position where I felt, I would say something nuanced about the rule. I personally think that 611 is bad. I think it did lead to unnecessary complexity. It did incentivize high-speed trading and intermediation, and that markets could work very well without it. But that would require something called best execution. And it would require that best execution is both enforceable and enforced. And it is neither of those things.
Nailing a wet noodle to the wall, I think, is the quote.
Like nailing Jello to the wall.
Jello.
Yes. And so it, you know, it started out. The roundtable started out, you know, kind of like, you know, if you can watch the video on YouTube. I mean, it's not the most exciting thing, but there was a point at which I made this exact point. I said, you know, best execution is abysmal in the US. And we know it is, right? We know it is. When FINRA comes out and they say in specific guidance, you cannot forego price improvement opportunities in order to collect payment for order flow. And then, you know, on CNBC, the CEO of one of the largest high-speed intermediaries comes out and he's like, on a given month, you know, customers get more price improvement than Robinhood customers do because Fidelity doesn't accept payment for order flow. And, you know, when I said that, it was like, you know, one of those scenes in a church, right? The whole room was like, oh, my God, what? I can't believe you would say such a thing. Citadel fainted next to me, and Sigma was like off in a tizzy, and you know, you can imagine. So, and all I could do was roll my eyes, and then everyone sort of. Then I became the panel punching bag, which is, you know, that's what I'm used to, so it was fine. And
well, that's why you train.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I do. You're right. I train.
That's why you train. Yeah.
And so, you know, the rest of the panel became, you know, forget what Dave said. Dave has no idea what he's talking about. You know, don't listen to Dave and all that. And I, you know, I still thought that I continued to fight back and push on this issue. And I said, look, you know, I think getting rid of 611 would be great. But like, when was the last best execution enforcement case? Go ahead, tell me. When? I'm waiting. Come on, right? Like, they don't happen. So either, yeah, everyone is amazing here in the US and nobody's ripping off their customers, totally normal for Wall Street, or it's not enforceable, like the guy who was in charge of enforcing it at FINRA said when he equated it to trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. And, so despite the fainting and and all that, I had some, I felt like I made my points and the points that I wanted to make. And I had great conversations afterwards with some people at the SEC, like a lot of people from the SEC were in the room. It was being, the roundtable was being run by the director of trading and markets, Jamie Selway, who's, someone that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years and talking to and interacting with about these issues, and who sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but he's always been like a very reasonable person and interested in understanding the perspective of the retail investor and sort of the new retail investor who actually understands markets. And so, I thought it was good. I don't know that it'll make a difference. I think a lot of it is sort of a foregone conclusion, and we'll see if the government ever does reopen. Maybe we'll get a proposal out of the SEC, and we'll see where things are going.
Early November. Early November. And
That's it gets close to early November. Oh man!
I think records like all-time high, all-time longest is something that sounds appealing to certain, so it might be second longest, the all-time longest, even though it was my record. It's like one of those Michael Phelps records. You can break it yourself. Why not? Right? Katie Ledecky style. So where do you see so if they when the government reopens, what do you think they'll
know?
I mean, no, I do know. I know.
Anything's possible is all I'm saying.
Increasingly so. What do you see the next steps for the 611 be?
So I think there was actually there were quite a few people who you would have thought would have been in favor of getting rid of 611 that said, hold on a second, sure, 20 years ago when you said this is not a good idea, you were right. However, it is 20 years later, and it is so ingrained and fundamental to our market structure that you can't just take it away. You have to be reasonable about it. I think that argument will probably win the day. There will probably be some level of incremental changes, like you could put a market share threshold. I don't have my notes in front of me, but it's something like if you put the market share threshold at 1%, so an exchange is no longer a protected venue at 1%. If it doesn't have at least 1% market share, you would get rid of a ton of the exchanges, out of the 16, something like 7 or 8 of them, something like that. Nearly all of which I believe are run by the big 3 exchange groups, NYSE, NASDAQ, and CBOE. All except for one, the long-term stock exchange. And so they would lose protected status, but how much would change? I can tell you up here in Canada, we have a market share threshold, and it has turned into a best X nightmare, and it hasn't reduced cost or complexity because for best X reasons, a lot of brokers believe they still have to connect to every place in case there's a better price. So it hasn't really changed anything. And I did make this point at the very end of the roundtable. They asked, does anyone have anything else that they would like to get on the record before we close the roundtable? And of course, I was the first hand to raise, and everyone rolled their eyes and said, okay, here we go again. And I said, I would like to get 2 things on the record. The first, this is just my favorite part of the roundtable, so I'm just reliving it. The first is that Ken Griffin said that internalization is the greatest threat to price discovery in financial markets, even though that has nothing to do with this roundtable. Everyone in the room laughed. It was a great moment.
We cited that quote extensively in our We the Investors. So citations
every chance
are there.
I get,
Yep.
Boom. Now, after I finished talking, the moderator went to the guy from Citadel and said, Joe, anything to say to Dave? And he's like, yeah, well, stop taking 20-year-old comment letter quotes out of context, out of comment letters.
Read the whole thing. Please go read the whole thing.
And it was just a complete lie. I'm sorry. You're going to get up on a round table and just lie, give me a break. There was nothing taken out of context. In fact, it was far more
Yeah.
fighting in the comment letter, highlighting all of the problems that we agree with and have seen happen over the last 20 years. So give
100%.
me a break. That was not taken out of context. That was bullshit. The second point that I made was that if you actually want to reduce cost and complexity, you need to move to something for market data and connectivity for exchanges that's called cost plus pricing, which means that since there is an obligation, best X, order protection, whatever it is, there's an obligation that brokers have to connect to all these exchanges. Since that obligation exists, exchanges have a monopolistic power of pricing over their data feeds and connectivity, and therefore they price those things at margins that IEX has calculated to be in the thousands of a percent. And so IEX, leading the way on this issue, put a filing in for market data that said, we are doing cost plus pricing. Here's our cost to provide market data, and here's we're adding we're actually going to charge to not recover all our costs, just most of them. And they put that out there. And every other exchange will say it cannot be done. You cannot have cost plus pricing. Again, it's BS. It's done. IEX has done it. Others have done it in Europe. So, it's very much possible. And I made that point at the end of the roundtable too. It's the kind of thing the exchanges hate, and it probably falls on deaf ears, so it doesn't matter. But you know what? It still felt like the right time, and so I thought it was. I thought I got to say what I had wanted to say, and it felt good.
Awesome. Well, I was in DC at the time, and it resonated across the city, not just the room. No, I know that's actually not hyperbole. I was at a
I
conference.
know, it's funny, right?
I was at a conference in DC, and apparently one of the attendees was at the morning session where Dave was speaking, and through just complete coincidence, Dave's name came up as an Urvin founder because of the context of the conference. And he's like, I saw that guy this morning. And I was like, yes, he did. Absolutely. No, he was, I think, impressed with your ability to stand up to the pugilism that existed within the room. Yeah, exactly. That's why you train. You got to train. All right. So it's not on the agenda, but one other thing before we pivot, still in the same topic area, is enchanted but not magical. Enchanted but not magical. So in July, Hester Pierce issued a statement talking about the tokenization of equities, and the statement was titled "Enchanted, Not Magical." And I just wanted to here real quick. I'll read something that she wrote. I think that highlights for me. There's a lot of enthusiasm, over the summer, right? You heard about Robinhood launching the Open AI and SpaceX tokens I think it was in France somewhere, and all of the hoopla around that. And then Open AI came back and said, we have nothing to do with this. And then Robinhood essentially tried to say, well, we have secured a stake in Open AI, and we're mapping that stake that we have with our tokens, so it's not completely ephemeral. Like there's something there, but this is essentially what Hester Pierce's statement was, July 9th this year. I'll read to you her section. Sometimes an issuer tokenizes its own security. For example, an operating company or an investment company could tokenize its shares. So the company is tokenizing its own shares. Alternatively, an unaffiliated third party with custody of securities issued by another entity might, for instance, issue a new tokenized security tied to the securities it holds, or may tokenize the security entitlements that investors hold against the custodians. Purchases of these third-party tokens may face unique risks, such as counterparty risks. And I think, this is something that I know a lot of industry participants are talking about, because it seems like equity tokenization is inevitable. At this point, you have major exchanges making partnerships to facilitate this process. But there's multiple types of equity tokenization, and they present two very different opportunities, both to investors and to companies, and very different risks. And I think this is something that is going to be brought up more and more. But to just kind of get ahead of that curve, Dave, what do you think generally about this pros and cons? And if you don't step all over my cons, I can share what I think my cons are. But
Yeah, I remember when Hester, when Commissioner Peirce said all that, and I actually really liked it. I thought it was good to hear from someone like her who was very crypto friendly and very libertarian. That, and if I had prepared for this, I would have had like one of my kids' old Harry Potter magic wands like handy. I've been like, it's not magic, right? But it can't be a way to skirt securities laws. And you can't think that just because you tokenize something automatically makes it not a security. Like, that's the same issue that the industry was criticizing Gensler for, which was just as soon as you tokenize something, it is a security, right? And so I think that it was a very measured and thoughtful response by Commissioner Peirce. And this is actually a really reasonable take right here, that this is another way
Don't
to
step on my negative.
but
right,
Bearcat,
keep going.
Bearcat.
No.
And so let me tell you, interesting. I had a conversation at the roundtable with somebody at a regulatory agency. I'm not going to say more than that. A very senior person at a major regulatory agency, and we were talking about tokenization. And he said, "I will tell you what tokenization is all about, and it's all about one thing: margin. That's it. Everyone else is going to throw all these other benefits, all this other stuff at you, and the thing nobody is talking about is margin. It's all about margin, collateral, the ability to shift things offshore for whatever reason." And he wasn't getting, for him, he was saying a lot of the reason that people shift stuff offshore, whether it's holding short positions that are shifted offshore outside of the regulatory environment of the US, is because it's cheaper to hold them there, let alone whatever abuses you can commit in Frankfurt and all, crazy shit like that. But what it comes down to is margin, carrying cost, and collateral requirements. And that's the danger with tokenization, is that as soon as it gets you out of the regulated space, out of the registered space, suddenly it's a way to commit regulatory arbitrage. And I agree, there are huge benefits to tokenization and stable coins and pricing things in stable coins and reducing friction and reducing costs and the ability to move things fast and transact fast and to have clear audit trails. I think all of those are great benefits, but there are definite opportunities for abuse. And I'm glad that Commissioner Peirce recognizes that as well, because she is a very influential voice in this crypto policy discussion. She's the one who convened and held the crypto roundtables that the SEC had this year. And I think, she's the chair of the crypto task force at the SEC. And it is a measured way of looking at the space to try and get the benefits of innovation while understanding that there are some serious risks here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a tremendous amount of benefit if executed upon in the right way, which is in large part with partnership from the underlying, partnership with the issuers. I think one of the risks, especially in the statement that Commissioner Peirce is identifying, is that third party risk that starts to grow the more attenuated the relationship becomes from the actual equity. Like when you think about the system as it exists right now, right? You have book entry, direct registered shareholders as the most direct way for a shareholder in a company to have a relationship. You are on the books of the company. Then one step removed from that is a non-objecting beneficial owner in a brokerage. Like you're in a brokerage, you're non-objecting, which means the company knows who you are, they have information, they can send you stuff. You're non-objecting, but it's one removed. Then there's objecting, meaning that you're essentially just in that blind spot. Right? Then you have now what's potentially a derivative of presumably one of those other three categories of holding, one of these other, well, I guess it's two because it's either seed and co or a book, but it's still a derivative of an underlying. And what I think is a major concern is the dilution of purchasing power in combination of what is 23/5 or 24/7 shareholder trading. 23/5, I think, is, most agreed upon is right around the corner. You're stretching the trading window, and so you're going to have increased spreads. And now what you're doing is stretching the purchasing attention, like the focusing power. If you have
Hmm.
platforms standing up these derivatives, which on the face of them, it says, Coca-Cola token. And you're like,
Right.
okay, I'm buying the Coca-Cola share. It's the digitized version, but really it's completely untethered. It's just a reference point. It's
Yep.
like it's an index to, if you're diluting that purchasing power, ultimately you're diverting it away from the underlying in the first
Yep.
instance. That
Yep.
purchasing shouldn't be going to the token. That purchasing should be going to Coca-Cola. And that's where, already you have stretched spreads. The only way you're gonna fill them up is with more purchasing power, but instead you're pulling the purchasing power over here. To whose benefit? And when she talks about when Commissioner
To
Pierce talks
whose
about,
benefit? Exactly.
right,
Yep.
if any of these entities declare bankruptcy, you have an unsecured interest. You have
Hmm.
nothing. There's
Yep.
zero. You have nothing. And bankruptcy is a very easy legal filing. Like you're essentially just holding an IOU for an IOU with no benefit to the underlying, no inherent rights to you. Um, It'll be interesting to see how it's rolled out, but in terms of the questioner, I think put it spot on, is what is the relationship of these tokenized equities to the issuer and the underlying, and how is it going to service markets? Like, how does this help markets in a way that markets need? Not necessarily the
Exactly.
token,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
necessarily the tokenized issuer, but um,
How does
yeah.
this make
So
markets better? How does this benefit investors and issuers? How does this improve price discovery?
mhm.
I don't hear a case for any of this for most of the things we're talking about. I think there are some interesting things about tokenizing things that aren't today securities and turning them into securities and pulling them into the registered space. I think that's super interesting. But this idea that you're going to tokenize things that are securities and are already in the registered space to get it out and for interested regulatory arbitrage, that I'm very concerned. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting space. All of this, and this is, why we wanted to have today's call. Is all of this is going to be evolving over the next year,
For
next
sure.
three and a half
This is
years.
the area to watch. And
Yeah.
just, so nobody thinks I'm dodging questions. We had one last question. Do I still hold GME? I sure do. Same position I've had. In fact, added to it, get some more warrants. I like the warrant idea. So, I think
They
I
showed
love
up
being,
nice and promptly at the transfer agent.
they did. And I like being part of the movement. And so I thank all of you for tuning in and listening. I thank you, Alex, for joining us and having this conversation. I found it fascinating. I hope everyone else did too. As always, leave a comment, as many of you have. Give us a YouTube follow if you're on YouTube. If you're somewhere else, you're probably already following us, but spread the word. Thanks. And we'll be back soon with another edition of Let's Talk Markets Live. And love you all too. Thank you.